Welcome to the first Center in Servingness webinar series of the year. I am so excited to welcome you all. Welcome also to the 2023 National HSI Week. Tomorrow, we are kicking off the Hispanic Heritage Month, which goes from September 15 until October 15. And finally, we're celebrating a number of Independence Days in different countries throughout Latin America. Así que estamos celebrando, estamos en celebración y qué mejor que celebrar con una excelente investigadora que nos va a hablar el día de hoy, la doctora Perry, la introduciré en un rato más. Bienvenidos a todos, por favor síganos diciendo de dónde son. Those of you who have been regular webinar participants, we want to thank you all for sticking with us. Can you believe this is the 5th year of the series? Se dice fácil, pero pues ha sido mucho trabajo. Gracias a todas las personas que lo han hecho posible. And those of you who are new to the webinar, we're so grateful that you're spending this time and chatting and staying with us today. We just saw that you all are from all over the US. It's amazing and beyond. My name is Adriana Arroyo Perez, and I am part of the Faculty Affairs team in the Office of the Provost. On behalf of Faculty Affairs and HSI initiatives at the University of Arizona, we want to welcome you. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary work that Dr. Judy Marquez-Quillama did for this series over the past 4 years. And I want to make sure I honor her excellent work and legacy and continue to offer this series in community, to our community in Tucson, nationally, and beyond. Muchas gracias a la doctora Quillama. I want to also thank the HSI Initiatives team, Monique Beltran. Thank you for everything, for setting up everything. Without her, I don't know what we would do. Dr. Carla Cruz Silva, also thank you very much. And of course, Dr. Marla Franco for her leadership and for letting this happen. Dr. Franco, would you please offer some words of welcome for our audience?
Yes, I just wanted to thank you and officially welcome you to the kickoff of our Centering Servingness webinar series for this academic year. My name is Marla Franco, and I serve as the Vice President for HSI Initiatives at the University of Arizona, as well as one of the co-founders of the AZ-HSI Consortium. I'm so honored to have our guest today, Dr. Vanessa Perry, who actually served as one of our inaugural HSI Fellows. And I'm so excited to see the advancement of this critically important work. This Centering Servingness webinar series really aims to highlight the leadership, the practice, the scholarship, the activity, the advocacy of people across the University of Arizona who are deeply committed to this work and are excited to share with you what this work looks like in practice. So without further ado, Adriana, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Franco. We begin today's webinar by respectfully acknowledging the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home of the Tohono O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. Dr. Gina Garcia's conceptualizing of the term servingness informs our webinar series. Servingness helps us to understand and highlight the faculty and staff who engage in scholarship and servingness efforts that honor the cultures, the lived experiences of Latina, Latinx, Latine, and Latino, Black, Indigenous, and underrepresented students and communities. I am going to share the objectives of the webinar series, which already Dr. Franco mentioned some, is to spotlight current scholarship offering examples of the rich ways in which servingness is enacted by faculty and staff across the institution, and also to learn together about engaging in these efforts and to build knowledge addressing the question each month of what are the next steps to build institutional capacity around HSI servingness. Our team will share the links to which you can access the recordings of the past 4 years. And we will also be recording today's session, so it is available for you and the community to see in the future. Those videos go into YouTube and they are public for everyone. And this is where it comes the exciting part of the webinar. Today's webinar features Dr. Vanessa Perry. Dr. Perry is Associate Professor of Practice at the University of Arizona. There she enjoys teaching MA counseling students and mentoring PhD counselor education and supervision students. In addition to serving as faculty, Vanessa is the Director of Graduate Studies for her department. This role has enabled her to develop and implement a holistic admission toolkit that furthers the HSI mission of the U of A. A toolkit she began developing during her time as an HSI Fellow. Vanessa enjoys researching and learning about Spanish, English bilingual counseling, clinical supervision, and counselor education. And in her free time, because she's amazing, she works as a disaster mental health volunteer for the American Red Cross. Así que denle la bienvenida a la doctora Perry. Muchas gracias, doctora.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Vanessa and my pronouns are she, her, ella. I really want to take a moment just to thank University of Arizona HSI Initiatives and Faculty Affairs for the opportunity to share some of my work. And I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit of a story. This is me from the first grade. I have always loved school, so much so that I never left. I had discovered what a library was a couple of years beforehand, and I was really stressed out when the librarian asked me to sign my name because I knew that signing meant cursive and I could barely just print my name. Even from a really young age, I very much valued higher education, and about the age of this photo is when I discovered what a PhD was. That was the literal highest you could go in school. So naturally, as a school-loving child, I decided that that is what I wanted to do. I wanted to go the highest in school. So I did. I saw some diversity in the faculty that mentored and taught me in undergrad, but I had very little diversity in my master's program. There wasn't a single Latinx professor, and there was one BIPOC professor. And there was not a single BIPOC faculty in my PhD program, and I couldn't even find a Latinx person to sit on my dissertation committee. As I became a professor, I became acutely aware that being a Latinx, about 2% of the population in general has a PhD, and about 5% of that is Latinxes. So this intersection of being Latinx and having a PhD is representative of a really rare, exceptional group. And my parents recognize this achievement too. This photo is my mom and my stepdad. My mom, she was really excited to graduate from high school. That's where her educational journey took her. So she's tremendously proud as a Mexican mom to tell everybody that her daughter has a PhD and is a professor at the University of Arizona. So I wanted to do my part to make the graduate school experience different for future generations of Latinxes because representation matters. But also, if we want to provide culturally responsive, culturally competent services out in the community when our graduate students get their degrees and go on to practice, to serve underserved communities, we want these communities to be served by people that look like them, be it counseling or whatever other profession. So then what does higher ed need to do in order to increase Latinx graduate degree attainment? So I started looking around and seeing, well, who actually gets graduate degrees? So this is some Census Bureau data that shows an increasing trend of degrees happening even in the midst of COVID. There's a bar graph on the left that shows 2001, and the bar graph on the furthest right shows 2021. And we can see that from 31.5 million to 52.8 million, bachelor's degrees really climbed. And we see the same pattern and increase in master's degrees from 11 million to 24.3 million. And then we look at professional degrees. So that would be an MD, a medical doctor, a JD, a lawyer, a DDM or DDS, a dentist, different types of professional degrees. And then a doctorate degree, the Census Bureau classifies as a PhD or an EdD. But we see those increasing too. But by and large, of all of the graduate degrees that are attained, very few of them are doctorates. So when we look at graduate degree attainment, of people 25 and over by race. This is more Census Bureau data. We can look at it by these 4 racial groups: white, non-Hispanic, Black, Asian, and Hispanic, any race. And we can see that Latinxs are falling behind the trend of growing postgraduate degree attainment for all 3 graduate degree types. We can see that there's a really huge disparity when we compare Latinxs to our white counterparts and even to other racial groups that our graduate degree attainment is the lowest of these 4 racial groups. But why does educational attainment even matter so much? It's not just necessarily saying that we can have providers out in the community upon graduation that look like the community themselves. It also means other things when someone has a graduate degree. Graduate degrees create financial opportunities later in life, and even more opportunities available with the more education you have. So if you look at this chart, you can tell somebody loves Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau. The facts always speak for themselves, but the more education you have, the greater your lifetime earnings are. So if you look at from top to bottom, this is the different degrees that people have and their median usual weekly earnings. So if somebody has a doctorate degree or professional degree, they're going to be earning somewhere between $1,750 and $2,000 per week, versus someone that has a bachelor's degree is going to be earning around $1,250 a week, and someone with a high school diploma a little over $750 a week. Additionally, we know that the more education people have, the less they experience unemployment. And also, if you have a graduate degree, we know that this can create more employment opportunities if you're trying to do a lateral move, and it also creates opportunities for upward mobility, which is really important. Okay, so then I'm talking about graduate degrees and money and income, but what does this have to do with HSI Servingness? Well, when we use holistic graduate admissions practices, that gives us an opportunity to enroll Latinx students, to get them in our doors, to change our practices so that more of them are coming through our gates. Also, holistic graduate admissions gives us the opportunity to examine the environments into which we are inviting Latinx students to enter. So once they get here, are Latinx students being served in this environment? And in having more Latinx students, we create more opportunities for servingness. So not just enrolling, moving beyond enrolling, but shifting our lens to servingness. Of course, we need to acknowledge our current political reality. The SCOTUS decision on affirmative action did not change anything for Arizona, because in 2010, Arizona passed Proposition 107, which amended the state constitution. And I'll read a part from Section 36A. This state shall not grant preferential treatment to or discriminate against any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. So again, this really hasn't changed anything for us, but it is a consideration that we need to keep in mind, that there are federal and state restrictions that prohibit us from asking explicitly about race or ethnicity, especially when we're working to serve Hispanic or Latinx populations. I think it's important to understand where the line is, where our legal boundaries are when it comes to admissions. Because if you don't know the line, if you don't know where the line is, you don't know when you are crossing it. And sometimes crossing the line doesn't matter to some people, and it does matter to others. So being aware of what the state law is and what your stance is in relation to it, but then how does that interact with our commitment as an HSI? Okay, so as was mentioned, I'm a professor in a graduate degree program. So if you want to be a therapist, you need a master's degree. So we have a Master of Arts program with a few different specialty areas. And I have been serving as faculty in this program since 2016. So when we have admissions, all of us faculty, we all do our own admissions. We last year we got 141 applicants for our master's program. It seems like each year we get more applicants than the previous year. And some materials that we will ask applicants for is what their GPA was. So we'll ask for transcripts, 3 letters of recommendation. Previously, we combined how we evaluated all 3 of those letters of rec. And we didn't really have a rubric for how we evaluated them, just a Likert scale on 1 to 3. We thought they were good without describing what a 1 was or what a 3 was. Same thing for a personal statement, really general, just, hey, why this program? Why the U of A? Why this profession? And we asked for a recent CV or resume. When I first started, our process was pretty subjective, and there was not really a strict map on how to evaluate individual items that each of the applicants was submitting, or how these individual items constituted parts of a whole that us faculty were evaluating largely individually. So these are just some of the materials that we asked for in our program, but different graduate programs may ask for different things. So let's talk about what are some common data points that people will ask for. Usually an undergraduate GPA and transcripts. Sometimes if you're in a science major, you'll ask for a science GPA and a non-science GPA, or a major GPA and a non-major GPA, which can sometimes be challenging if you are in a science domain, because some STEM professors notoriously do not believe in inclusive or collaborative pedagogy. Hence, this type of pedagogy does not align with not only Latinx students, but a lot of other BIPOC students as well. So you might see students that have a lower science GPA that reflects this. Test scores. So I'll talk a little bit about the GRE and why I discourage programs from including it in their admissions toolkit. Letters of recommendation, and that can be various people that have seen somebody's clinical work, their interaction with community members or patients, people that can attest to their interpersonal skills, professors that can speak to somebody's academic capacity. Experiential hours. Maybe, somebody has volunteered in the community, or a program requires a minimum of X amount of hours volunteering somewhere or in a certain setting. Usually a CV or resume is not too uncommon, but this can be challenging for students that perhaps were working during their participation in undergrad, and that work did not necessarily have anything to do with what their graduate degree program is going to be in, and a personal statement. So I really think it's helpful for programs to think about, what does your personal statement prompt say? Is it clear? Most are not clear. Most are very vague. And is it easily understood by students from Latinx backgrounds? Perhaps try being as behavioral as possible, asking for an instance when you navigated a certain type of situation, for example. Because for a lot of students, sharing about all of their strengths and triumphs or barriers that they overcome can be challenging, because it can feel a little bit braggadocious, or it can feel like it violates some of our cultural norms. Okay, so those are just some things that programs might ask for. I'm going to talk about the GRE. So for programs that require the GRE has limited predictability. And I found this article that's cited here that is a meta-analysis that gave a really good breakdown on why the GRE just doesn't have it's not working the way that we think it is. And that's often why, if the GRE was a perfect tool, then you would probably see programs using just the GRE, right? That there would be this hard and fast cutting score, and we could say anybody that has above this score is welcomed into our master's program. But the GRE is flawed, and so we incorporate other measures, other indicators, like test scores or letter of recommendation. So this body of research talking about the limited predictability, we can't say that somebody with this score is going to do well in our program. So it doesn't, the GRE is not a reliable it can't really tell us what's going to happen in the future. And it also fails to predict socioeconomic effects. The GRE is often a representation of somebody's wealth, or in other words, their SES, their socioeconomic status, rather than some of the developed skills that they have. So in short, the GRE is not measuring what we think it is. There's a ton of research that looks at GPA. A lot of the research looks at high school GPA and undergraduate admissions, but there is some that looks at undergraduate GPA for graduate admissions. But what I've found is I can't find a conclusive piece of information that talks about with this GPA, this is going to happen. So lots of conflicting research. It might be predictive of first-year performance, but then it kind of diminishes in its predictive ability beyond that. It might be predictive of overall performance, but really more so the first year. Okay, so if you're looking to revamp your admissions process for a graduate program, I recommend including alternative data points. So if your graduate college or school requires that you use the GRE, what are some other things that you can add to the digital materials applicants are submitting? Letters of recommendation, personal statements, of course. Also think about a writing sample. Maybe you're going to give somebody an article that you want them to critique. Perhaps you ask them about a trend in the field, or you give them a vignette or a case example to which you'd like for them to respond. Considering weighing items differently. So for example, if you are bound to include the GRE, then maybe you weigh it if there's like 50 points of total, maybe you make it worth 5 points and you make other aspects like a personal statement worth 10 points, right? So playing with how you weigh different items and weighing letters of rec and personal statements more heavily. Developing rubrics for evaluation of materials that provide quantitative scores for data points. This is probably one of my strongest recommendations because often people like me who are faculty in a program are doing admissions, haven't had any training on how to do admissions, just sort of like, okay, here's a list of people on our online portal, let's review all of their stuff. And so what I think is exceptional or poor is wildly different than what a colleague thinks is exceptional or poor. So making sure that we have a consensus that we've stopped as a team to say, okay, well, what means on a scale, a Likert scale of 1 to 5, what do I say is a 1 or a 3 or a 5? So I know that what you think is a 1, a 3, or a 5, so we can have better inter-rater reliability. So giving us some type of a narrative that gives us examples of where, of what an item might look like on either end of the Likert scale. Include data points that will allow applicants to demonstrate traits or knowledge competitive applicants possess. So think about asking about language, linguistic diversity, right? That's an aspect of diversity that is often overlooked, but we know it's a huge part of many Latinx people's experiences. In counseling, for example, to be a bilingual person, to be a bilingual counselor is such an asset. Are we even asking about that and collecting that type of data? So for whatever graduate program, are there other specialty skills or experiences that people have, especially if those are commonly had by Latinx people? Are we asking about those? And lastly, develop a scale that will increase the likelihood of earning an interview for BIPOC or underrepresented applicants. So for example, this is where we get a little bit creative. I'll talk about in our program how we've talked about diversity and different barriers that people have experienced as a consequence of some of their racial and ethnic backgrounds, but we don't explicitly ask that information. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But how can we think outside the box to include holistic items that evaluate other assets we know that our diverse students possess? Okay, let's talk about letters of recommendation for a moment. I love letters of recommendation because they can shed light on the lived experience that somebody has had, their resilience, their determination, and their ability to overcome obstacles. And I know that all of those intrapersonal qualities make for a strong graduate student, because when someone is writing a paper and they have to dig deep and figure out their writing style and how to access journals, right? That if they have been determined and resilient in other situations, then it transfers over to their graduate school experience. Letters of rec also emphasize an applicant's ability to thrive in diverse environments and adapt to new challenges that can strengthen their application, especially if they come from recommenders who can attest to the applicant's experiences navigating different cultural contexts. So in addition to lived experience, we can learn more about their resilience. Letters of rec can also give us context for somebody's academic performance. Maybe somebody had some broader challenges, some barriers that we know Latinx folks often experience. So they can give us the context of what was happening with those, so that they're not immediately dismissed or disqualified because of some of those barriers that they were facing. Also, there might be some other cultural experiences that somebody has, maybe a piece of community engagement or involvement that doesn't fit anywhere else in their application materials, but they can they can ask somebody from somewhere that that they volunteered. They can ask that recommender to speak about that experience, their community engagement within different BIPOC communities that shows their ability to contribute positively to academic and social environments. Okay, so sometimes we are trading one practice that's biased like a Jerry for another. So it's important to talk a little bit more about the pragmatics of letters of recommendation. Letters of rec can be biased. They are modestly predictive of undergrad and graduate academic success and moderately predictive of whether or not someone's going to get their degree. And I have some recommendations for how you can increase your predictability in what I suspect. So often we are super broad in what we ask a program, when a program asks a recommender to assess. So through our automated portal, we'll allow an applicant to input the name and contact information of a recommender, and off it goes. And they'll get a message from our program that says like, hi, this person is interested in a graduate program. Can you tell us more about them? Or can you speak to their strengths that would make them good for this program? And that's it. That's really, really vague. It's not asking me to evaluate their ability to handle ambiguous situations, their critical thinking skills, a situation where they had to use some conflict resolution skills, right? Like these more specific things that I think would be more telling. So we're really vague in what we ask a recommender to assess. So consequently, letters of recommendation are super unsystematic in what constructs are assessed by the recommender. So some people may talk about applicant's motivation or their self-efficacy or their personality or resistance. So what we're getting from people is really vague. It's all over the place because we're very vague in what we're asking. So we get what we asked for. So I suggest having a combination of a Likert scale where you're asking different attributes or traits to be assessed that have to do with intra and interpersonal qualities, because we already know about somebody's academic capacity from some of the other things that we collect, like transcripts and test scores. So having a Likert scale with perhaps a little bit of a write-in portion. Okay, additionally, so we're vague in the way that we ask recommenders. So recommenders are vague in giving us the information. And then beyond that, we're vague in the way that we evaluate letters of recommendation. So how I look at it and how another colleague looks at a letter of recommendation is probably going to be wildly different. And with so many applications, I don't have time to read 141 times 3, whatever that number is. That is too many letters for me to read. I don't have time to read everybody's letter, right? Only a subset of letters. So we need to make sure that from colleague to colleague, we're evaluating letters in a consistent format. So we need to standardize that process. Otherwise, we're introducing a whole huge amount of bias into that process. However, when a standardized template is shared with recommenders, so perhaps we give them a template of, if we're requesting a letter of recommendation, here's a template posted on the website that asks for different attributes that you'd like to be assessed, right? So that typically yields better standardized data that doesn't give us gender or racial differences. Because without that, for female students, recommenders tend to write letters of rec that talk about somebody's their personality, their tenacity, these intra and interpersonal qualities. And for male students, recommenders tend to talk about their academic performance and leadership. So there are really large gender differences in what recommenders write in these letters, which I thought was pretty surprising, but understandable. And I would also encourage us to ask recommenders to talk about other factors that are important to our program that are beyond cognitive skills, because those are aptly measured elsewhere. So right now, I think that the way that letters of recommendation are used by graduate programs just has so much untapped potential. So I think if we can standardize what we're asking of people, how we get that information, and how we evaluate those letters, that we can dramatically increase this tool in our holistic admissions toolkit. So for example, instead of asking someone to submit a letter of rec, we give a Likert scale with the write-in portion, where we might ask questions like, on a scale of 1 to 10, please provide feedback on this person's ability to serve a patient in the future. Okay, so let's say that someone has gone through all of the digital submission of materials, and they've been selected by your admissions team for an interview. I have an idea, I have a recommendation. What if we granted each Latinx or BIPOC or underrepresented student an interview? I know that this may be controversial, but interviews are tough, but they allow students to display interpersonal qualities that are difficult to convey in your digital materials. And I think that a lot of someone's digital materials don't account for a lot of the gaps in opportunity, gaps in mentorship or leadership that a Latinx student might have experienced. But if we can get them in front of us and evaluate their inter and intrapersonal qualities in an interview, then we can make a more informed decision. So if you really, really want to be radical, I would recommend hosting workshops for your program on how to give successful interviews, how to write a professional personal statement, and other winning strategies for asking for letters of recommendation. Let me pause and check and see if we have any questions from the chat.
Hi, Vanessa. So no questions specifically, but I'm just loving the chat that is happening, because folks are really just providing some commentary regarding some of the practices that they incorporate and the extent to which they've been effective. So definitely encourage folks to continue utilizing the chat to share and exchange. And certainly if there are folks who have questions, definitely get them ready.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So those are some recommendations for programs broadly speaking, but I want to bring it back to my experience at the University of Arizona, our Master of Arts in Counseling program, and what our process looked like. So when I first came, we asked for a few digital materials. That was somebody's personal statement, 3 letters of recommendation, a transcript, and a CV. And we had we broke up the list, and essentially we'd each read about 20 digital materials and evaluate them whether or not we recommended them for an interview. And an interview would be conducted by one faculty member. And what I found is that what I thought was a really great interview and what somebody else thought was a great interview was wildly different. So in order to increase some inter-rater reliability, I guess you could say, into that practice, we added a second interviewer. So, and this we still do now, we interview applicants in 2-person teams. That takes a lot more time and resources, I acknowledge, but we feel like that has improved the quality of student that we admit into our program. And I want to note that these are gradual changes that we've done over time. We didn't just throw out our entire admissions model. But, as I participated in the HSI Fellows program, I went and I spoke to a lot of different experts around the University of Arizona. I've read articles about graduate admissions until my eyes have bled. I have consulted with a lot of extremely knowledgeable colleagues within the HSI community to come up with these different interventions and to tweak them so they work for our program. So these have worked for us. But I think that of the tools that I mentioned here, that you can pick and choose what will work for you and tweak it in your own way. So that was the first thing that we did. So then second, in 2020, we came up with a rubric for personal statements and letters of recommendation with quantitative and qualitative components. So what that looks like, I know that this is a screenshot, so the text is a little small, so I'll give you an idea of what it says. So this is a question within our internal portal called Grad App that only faculty will see. So when we're in this platform reviewing admissions materials, we will get a little drop-down menu where we can build out what the prompt says and then like what our score is. So this would be asking me, a faculty person, reading somebody's personal statement, if it's truly outstanding, average, or poor. So for truly outstanding, we're saying that that's top 15%. For poor, we're thinking bottom 15%. And average, we're thinking middle 70%. Because we found that a lot of us were thinking that everything was exceptional and outstanding. We're counselors, you can't blame us, right? We think everyone sharing their story is great. And we broke it down and shared different components that we thought would be in an exceptional personal statement. So they talked about their commitment to counseling and graduate work, counseling-related experience and specialty-related experience, and personal factors that may impact success in this program, that it has an excellent grasp of scholarly writing skills, right? So we took what was essentially just like a 1 to 5 or whatever it was before, and we gave a description, a narrative description of which each one of those was. And we also made it a scale of 1 to 9. So we had more specificity. And we did the same thing for letter of recommendation. But previously, letters of recommendation were evaluated all 3 together. And what we found is that maybe someone had one really good letter and the other 2 were sort of lukewarm. So we wanted to be able to evaluate each one of these letters individually to give room for feedback from individual perspectives. So if someone had an employer, a professor, and a volunteer work supervisor, those are all going to be very unique perspectives. So we wanted to make sure that we are evaluating them differently. Okay, so the next, we revamped the personal statement prompt to reflect our diversity and inclusion values. We really had to take pause as a program to figure out, so we want more diverse students here. We're an HSI or a land-grant institution. So what does that actually mean to us? And what does that look like in practice? How can we get more of those students here? So as a consequence of this, more BIPOC, LGBTQ+, first-gen or disabled applicants were more easily identified and invited to interview. How did we do this? So what we did is we have a personal statement prompt that asks applicants to share experiences working with diverse people or as a diverse person. So they elect to share what they feel comfortable sharing. But we also share that we very much value diversity, equity, and inclusion in our program. So sharing that is what we value. Tell us about your experience with some of our values. And so that helped us identify some barriers that people might have experienced, really just gaining more insight about the applicants that might be helpful in their career as a counselor, or even perhaps sometimes their lack of insight about the importance of DEI in the counseling profession. So as a consequence of that, here's this drop-down menu. This is another screenshot. So basically, if a student shares in their personal statement that they are BIPOC, LGBTQ, first gen, or has a disability, we will mark yes or no. Somebody being diverse does not mean that they are guaranteed admission, does not mean that we will automatically offer them a spot, but it does mean that we allocate more preference points to their application, which makes them more likely to be invited to an interview. So this identification really allows for applicants to account for any opportunity gaps that they might have experienced that aren't going to, these gaps that show up on their CV, perhaps some mentorship or some training that they might not have had, or just any other differences in their application that are representative of some barriers that diverse communities often face. Okay, and lastly, for this admission cycle, we just did this. I built it out in Grad App a couple weeks ago. I'm happy to share that we added an adversity scale. We added supplemental questions to our application, and we revamped our interview process to have to use an MMI model. And that's a multiple mini interview, if I'm saying it right, that med schools often use. And our interview process will also include a writing prompt and a group component as part of our interview process. So let me break this down. First, let's talk about the adversity scale. So if you're one of my colleagues from University of Central Florida, hopefully this rings a bell. But so I attended, there was a U.S. Department of Education summit that was shortly after the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action. And it was extremely helpful in just having people from different universities across the country sharing about some of the things that they do to ensure that they have diverse students, that they are opening the door to diverse students. And so the UC Davis School of Medicine talked about something that they use, the Davis scale. They have one of the most diverse medical schools in a state where affirmative action was banned in 1996. So essentially, they take a score, and I'll show you some sample questions from an adversity scale, but they take an adversity score from 0 to 99. So the higher the number, the more adversity somebody has faced. And they combine that as a metric along with letters of recommendation, test scores, essays, and interviews. And I snagged a good quote from an article on this. There is no set formula on how to balance the scale with the academic record, but a simulation of the system revealed that students from underrepresented groups grew to 15.3% from 10.7%, and that the share of economically disadvantaged students tripled to 14.5% of the class from 4.6%. That's huge, right? So using an adversity score could really be a great way for programs to increase their Latinx enrollment. A lot of our people face adversity. Okay, so this is one of the questions that we're using. So when applicants go into our portal, they will, upload transcripts, upload letters, personal statement, submit contact information for letters of recommendation. And then there's a list of 15 questions. So the top of the question says, and this is what we got to write, the following set of questions are meant to learn more about adversities applicants might have experienced that impacted their educational experiences as a way to provide increased equity in our admissions process. So letting them know we're not just some nosy people wanting to know if things were rough growing up for you. We're really trying to learn this information as a way to contextualize the information that you're sharing with us in your application. So people will respond with either a 0 or a 1, making it kind of easy for me to export into an Excel spreadsheet, because sometimes systems are clunky. So this is my way of working within our platform. So asking someone, what was your first language learned? And 0 for English and 1 for a language other than English. So not only this is evaluating whether or not someone might have experienced barriers out as a result of language injustice, but also identifying that to us, being multilingual is an asset. So here's a point for that. Presently, what is the language in which you feel most comfortable communicating? So looking at what somebody's dominant language is. Have your members or immediate family ever used federal or state assistance programs? Are you from a family that ever received public assistance? Prior to graduation from high school, did you contribute to the overall family income as opposed to working primarily for your own discretionary spending money? Did you graduate from a high school at which many of the enrolled students were eligible for free or reduced price lunches? Did you graduate from a high school from which a low percentage of seniors received a high school diploma? Did you not complete high school as planned, receive an AHS diploma, or earn a GED? Are you from a school district where 50% or less of graduates go to college, or college education is not encouraged. Have you ever been a Pell Grant recipient? Are you the first generation in your family to attend college? Did neither parent attend college? Did you participate in an academic enrichment or summer bridge program before starting your undergraduate degree? How many hours per week did you work while completing your undergrad degree? And so we kind of said above or below 20 hours for this. Have you ever lived in government subsidized housing? Are you from a family that lives in an area that is designated or known as being economically disadvantaged? So you can see how these questions, without asking about somebody's race or ethnicity, they get at a lot of the adversities and barriers that Latinx applicants might face. And they give them some points in their favor that would increase the likelihood of them being invited to an interview. And it lets them know, it signals to them that us as a program, this is something that's important to us, understanding the larger context in which somebody was raised, their broader educational experiences took place. So as you think about different things that you can implement, if it's a writing sample, a letter of rec, an adversity scale, be flexible in ways that you're coming up with different formulas to see who gets invited to an interview, for example. We had to sort of tweak this formula a bunch to figure out, well, what should we make personal statements worth? What should we make GPA worth? To come up with a result that had diverse applicants that were being invited for interview. And the same thing when we're coming up with what would, based on the points that we assign, but what our cutting score be for who we're going to be admitting to this program. So it wasn't super easy. We had to sort of play with the numbers a little bit. And my experience, as well as a lot of the literature that's out there about incorporating holistic admissions tools, says the same thing, that sometimes you have to retool things a few times to figure out how weighting things is going to work best for your program. Okay, so let's talk about some of the changes we're incorporating to our interview process. We're going to use an MMI model. So what that is essentially like speed dating. So let's say that there's 5 of us faculty, we each have one question that we ask applicants. So I'm going to ask the same question to all of the applicants. Hence, I'm going to be evaluating each applicant the same way. So if I have, I don't know, a scale of 1 to 5, I ask everyone the same question in the same way, and then I can evaluate all of those questions through my perspective. What I found is that us as a counseling program, the way that we evaluated participants or applicants' responses to questions was so different. What I thought was a really robust response, somebody thought was a weak response, or vice versa. But if one person is asking the same question over and over again, they are consistent in the way that they evaluate that question. So that's what makes using an MMI model really helpful in terms of increasing inter-rater reliability. It takes a little bit more planning for us to figure out how to do that, but that's something that we're going to be doing because we acknowledge that how we evaluate applicants' responses to our interview questions needs to have better reliability. So programs that use MMIs, not just med school, but other programs are starting to adopt this model. They tend to result in higher inter-rater reliability and an increase in their cohort diversity. Writing prompts. So what we're going to do is give somebody a real-time writing prompt where, we have a bunch of computers in the room and we have accommodations for people that have access needs, that have disabilities. And we give them, we'll say 30 minutes, and we give them a prompt and we'll say, hey, tell us about how you would work with somebody in a counseling context who had values or ideas that were very diametrically opposed to your values and ideas. How would you handle this type of a situation? So I'm really trying to get at somebody's intrapersonal skills, their critical thinking, their perspective of the world. Because we know that personal statements can be edited and edited and edited by everybody's tutors, mentors, teachers, right? That sometimes the personal statement that we get might not always be the student's own words. I'm thinking of ChatGPT here especially, right? So a real-time prompt that is on the fly has very little room for coaching, and you're more likely to get an authentic answer from an applicant. So we're going to ask this question and collect a writing sample. And we agreed that we're not going to be doing this to evaluate somebody's writing skills, but more of the content, their intrapersonal skills. And we will also develop a rubric to evaluate this writing prompt. And lastly, we've added a group component to our interview process. We're going to give students a team exercise to complete together. We haven't quite figured out the details of what that group exercise is going to look like, but we really want to understand people's interpersonal skills, their ability to work with other people. So whereas the writing prompt looks at somebody's own insights, the group component looks at people's ability to work well with other people. Because we found that those two skill sets are so tremendously important for people who are counselors in training. So we've modified our practices to make sure that we're getting at some of these things. And I think that if we're going to talk about holistic admissions or talking about opening the door so to have more Latinx students, that I certainly have to take a moment to talk about retention. If we get students here, it is our duty to support them and to make sure they have their needs met so that they're able to be successful and matriculate through programs. So what are some needs that you need to think about when we're serving Latinx communities? Some basic needs. What resources does your university, college program offer for housing, food, childcare, transportation, mental health support? And so I like to talk about mental health support as bienestar and well-being as a more culturally competent way. But do they have access to tutoring or academic advising? Some good questions to ask about your program. Are you using culturally responsive pedagogy? Are instructors engaged in ongoing training? Is there Spanish instruction or fieldwork that's being offered? How is community built? So some final thoughts for you. Holistic graduate admissions presents an enormous opportunity for us to enact servingness. With intention, we can modify admissions practices in order to open the door. But in order to practice this intention, it takes a fair amount of time, effort, and resources that need to go into our planning and program evaluation. So we need to be our own best advocates for program department and college level resources to engage in this meaningful work. How resources are allocated says much more about our values than a diversity statement we might have on our website. So as we go back to this little girl who was lucky enough to have enough merit and privilege to make it into and through a PhD program, I think about my grandparents, my dad's parents. My grandpa didn't complete elementary and my grandma didn't complete high school. They picked cotton in rural Texas in Northern California for 40 cents an hour. So many things could have gone differently in my family. So many more barriers could have been placed in my way to a graduate degree, but instead I found an open door. So how can we ensure Latinx students can open our doors? So I offer this webinar in honor of my ancestors, namely my grandmother, whose spirit inspires me to advocate for our Latinx community. And here's a quick little clip I will share of her.
Wow, thank you so much. If speaking about culturally relevant everything and HSI Servingness, I love it. I want to hear more about your mom singing. Y esa canción es profunda. Muchísimas gracias, Doctora Perry, Vanessa. I saw that there's, people are reacting. See, a lot of hearts, a lot of good energy. And as Marla said, I saw a really nice discussion in the chat. And thank you very much to everyone who was sharing. Please.
Yeah, and there is one question in the Q&A.
Yes. Do you have Kale from Kale, who is also participating a lot in the chat? Do you have any thoughts on how you could do a writing prompt during a some interview?
Sure. That's a great question. We've talked a little bit about this for our out-of-state applicants. So we thought about utilizing one of our staff people to host a Zoom session where somebody's able to share their screen or not. I mean, I think if someone is able to in 20 minutes utilize resources, there's not a lot of chat GPT and utilization of resources that you can do in 20 minutes, but just asking them to hop on and then live giving them the prompt. Here's your prompt, and sitting on Zoom and answering any questions, and asking them to submit in the chat their prompt at the end of that. That's our preliminary approach to doing it. So we'll see how it goes. We can let you know.
Anyone else? We also invite you to unmute and engage in discussion if you want to share your question out loud or write it.
Just briefly, Vanessa, I know you've had an opportunity to engage in conversation with colleagues at other institutions that are in different academic fields. And so I'm curious about just some of your observations that you've seen, commonalities and differences as maybe you've consulted with with folks who perhaps maybe are in the medical field or other areas, and what your observations are.
Sure. I think that there is a very vastly different understanding of what the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And in some disciplines, it's embraced, and in others, it's kind of scorned. So I think being careful of the language that we use to for colleagues that might take a little bit of warming up to do, or might need some further explanation in order to get their buy-in. But I've seen a lot of difference in people's willingness to change our current practices based on the discipline. That's probably been like the largest difference that I've seen. Counselors, of course, right? We are people-loving people, so we're going to be very inclined to put on that anti-racist hat and change our practices. I've been so grateful to have very receptive colleagues. But in some other STEM fields, there may not be buy-in from everybody that's doing admissions, so they might take some more convincing.
Thank you.
Is there time for one more question? There is. I have a question myself. Thanks for enlightening us. Do you see the use of these, specifically the question, the disadvantage question, widely used in a lot of programs, or is something that's been here and there? From your research, what do you see schools doing this?
I don't see it very widely used. And it wasn't until I watched at the summit through the Department of Education that I saw that, and I just thought, oh, this is tremendous. In a lot of the articles that I've read, I've seen very teeny tiny little bits of mention to considering different adversity factors, but I haven't seen other programs using a very straightforward adversity scale. So I'm thinking that we're probably going to see that happen more in practice, which makes me very excited.
Wow, so you're at the forefront.
Gosh, I hope so.
I love it. Well, if there isn't any other question, I would like to thank you, Dr. Perry. Thanks, Marla. Thanks, Monique, and everyone who attended from all over the United States, here in Arizona, here in the UFA. I hope from reading the chat, everyone liked it and loved it. And I hope if you work in admissions and to incorporate this, we already hear this is at the forefront of practices for a more equitable student body of graduate students. This is very important work, and I invite you to register for the next webinar we have every month but December until the spring of next year. And so please be in touch with us, register for the webinar. All of them are amazing, and let's keep celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month as HSI Institutions Week. And we will welcome you the next month. Please be pending. Thank you very much.